troubleshooting startup errors, there are two approaches you can take. First, you can memorize a list of errors along with the possible solutions. Or second, you can try to place the errors you encounter into the system startup process, and then use what you know about how a computer starts to identify potential problems and solutions. If you are preparing for a certification exam, you might find the first approach to be the most efficient. But what happens if you see a problem on the exam that you didn't memorize? Or what happens in the real world when the problems you encounter aren't quite like those you studied? In these cases, understanding how things work and the possible problems at each stage can help. In this video, we'll look at the boot process in the context of what you can see and hear and what is happening during each phase. Then we'll look at the common problems that can occur during each stage. We previously talked about the boot process as starting with post, moving to the boot loader, then moving to the operating system load, and then progressing on to user logon. We're going to examine this process based on what you can see and hear at the computer to help you identify which stage in the process you are at. For example, the first thing you do when you start a computer is you give it power. So you might hear fans running or you might see lights coming on. At some point, the BIOS program should load and initiate the video on the screen. So these two steps apply to the post process. Next, you might have access to a boot menu. For example, you might be able to choose the operating system, or you might have the advanced startup options, which allows you to enter safe mode. These items on the screen are associated with the bootloader process. Next, you'll typically see a Windows logo or a message that says something similar to Windows is loading, or the operating system is loading. And this corresponds to the operating system load process. This is when the NTOS kernel program is located and loaded. And finally, you'll see the logon screen, and this associates directly with the logon phase. And finally, following logon, you may see the completed desktop and a completely functional computer. When troubleshooting, one of the things you can do is to identify where you are at in the process. For example, if you can see the boot menu, but you do not progress to the Windows loading screen, then you know the problem is somewhere between these two phases. For example, the process of the boot menu identifies that the bootloader code has loaded successfully. If you do not see the Windows loading logo, perhaps the computer is unable to find the corresponding Windows operating system files. So let's take a look at each of these items that you can see or hear and examine what happens and the potential problems that can occur during those stages. The first thing that happens in the startup program process is you start your computer. What happens though if you push the power on your computer and you hear and see nothing? Well, this would typically indicate that the computer does not have power. You need to check things such as, is it plugged in? Or maybe you check the power switch on the power supply to make sure that it's on and that the voltage is properly selected. Another thing to check is the motherboard power switch to make sure that the cable that connects the case power button to the motherboard is actually connected. I recently upgraded a computer, and after putting it together, I had this exact situation happen. I turned on the power and nothing happened. It was completely silent, the screen was completely dead. I checked that it was plugged in and that the power switch was on the power supply. It was only once I connected the motherboard power cable to the motherboard, however, that the computer would turn on. Once you turn on the computer, you'll typically hear some fans blowing. You might even see a few lights. This indicates that the motherboard has power. The next process to happen is that the CPU is started. The CPU requires the BIOS and memory. And the final stage in this process is it initializes the video card. If the video card loads successfully, and if everything up to this point works, you will see output on the screen. However, what happens if you hear the fans power on, and you see some lights, but nothing else happens? Well, in that case, you need to examine these components. Is there a CPU? Does it have a heatsink and fan installed? Is the BIOS successful? Is there memory that actually works? And is there a video card? Typically, if the CPU functions, you hear additional beeps. The beep codes sometimes can tell you what the problem is. For example, there might be a beep code that indicates that the system does not have any memory, or a beep code that indicates that there is no video card present. The exact pattern of these beeps and the meaning of those beeps depends on the motherboard and the BIOS manufacturer. If there are no beeps, or if you don't have a way to interpret the beeps, one solution that you can use at this point is to simplify the system to its most basic level, and that typically means removing everything except for the CPU, the memory, and the video card. These are the three components that you add to a computer that it requires in order to start. If you have multiple memory modules, remove every module except for one, and make sure you're using a video card that works. If you reduce your system and it still doesn't work at this point, try swapping out the memory with another module. For instance, I built a new computer and had 4 memory modules. When the computer started up, I would get a single beep, followed by a long pause, followed by one more beep, and this process would repeat itself. What was happening is that the CPU was not able to access the memory, and the single beep indicated that the CPU was restarting itself. I didn't know that at the time, and so what I did was I pulled out all the memory, and I started up the computer, and the exact same thing happened. One beep followed by a pause, followed by another beep. And what had happened is the first memory module was faulty and preventing the system from booting. Once I replaced that one memory module, it had these 3 required components, and I was able to see video on the screen and the BIOS was able to load correctly. If you're still having problems, you might test your CPU on another system, or swap the CPU with one that you know that works, and the same with the video card. If your computer has the required 3 elements, CPU, memory, and video, you should, at this point, see output on the screen. You should see information about the BIOS loading. Errors that occur at this point are related to the BIOS. Common problems you might see are missing devices. Or you might see devices that are misconfigured. So for instance, you may have a CPU that is rated at 1000 megahertz, but when the BIOS loads, you see that it is really operating at 800 megahertz. Or perhaps the BIOS will actually show you an error